The world has come to recognize Geronimo as one of history's greatest warriors. Leading small bands of Apache on raids, Geronimo struck fear into the hearts of early settlers of New Mexico and Arizona. His ability to disappear into the dusty landscape proved frustrating to the United States troops who pursued him throughout the arid region. When he finally surrendered in 1889, Geronimo was the last renegade of the Chiricahua Apache. His final surrender marked the ending of the Indians' real threat to white settlers of the Southwest. The story of Geronimo's life is one of the most recounted tales in Native American history, even though little is known about Geronimo's personality or his day-to-day experiences. Geronimo related that he was born in June 1829 in Nodoyan Canyon, Arizona, but many historians claim Geronimo was born in 1827. Geronimo was given the name Goyaałé at birth and was called this until his late teens. Goyaałé's grandfather was the chief of a Chiricahua Apache tribe. Goyaałé's father was not a chief because he had joined his wife's tribe of Bedonkohe Apache, thereby losing his right to rule by heredity. Mangus Coloradas succeeded Goyaałé's grandfather as chief of the Chiricahua Apaches, a position Goyaałé might have held otherwise. At the age of 17, sometime around the year 1846, Goyaałé was invited to join the Council of Warriors, signifying that he was now considered a man in the tribe and not a boy. As a member of the council, he was eligible to fight in battle and to marry. Goyaałé gave many ponies to the father of a young woman named Alop, and she became his wife. In his lifetime, Goyaałé married about 8 times. His many children from these marriages would not live easy lives. 4 of his children were killed by Mexicans, and 4 were imprisoned by the United States government. Intermittent warfare broke out between Mexican settlers and the various bands of Apache in the mid-1800s. The conflict was not new to the Apache. Centuries before, the Spanish conquistadors had eagerly ensnared the Indians to sell them on the lucrative slave market. The Apaches, unlike other, more subdued Indian tribes, had responded with swift counterattacks before retreating into the harsh mountain terrain, which was unsuitable for farming. Thereafter, the Apaches' economic structure grew dependent on raiding settled communities. Following the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848, in which the United States acquired most of present-day Arizona, New Mexico, California, Nevada, Utah, Texas, and parts of Wyoming and Colorado, the Americans pledged to prevent Apaches from raiding across the border into Mexico. But this was a difficult policy to implement, as the Apaches could not relinquish a pattern of raiding that had sustained them for centuries. In 1858, a group of Apaches was attacked near Janos, Chihuahua, by a mixed group of Mexican troops and settlers. Goyaałé's mother, wife, and 3 children were killed. After the death of his family, Goyaałé sat alone in the mountains, weeping for his loss. As he grieved, he heard his name called 4 times by spirits, after which he was told that he could never be killed by a bullet and that the spirits would always guide his arrows. Armed with his new power, Goyaałé began a personal crusade for the revenge of his family that would not end for more than 30 years. Though he could not bring his family back, Goyaałé claimed in his autobiography that he could rejoice in this revenge. Goyaałé was given the name Geronimo during his first fight after the spirits spoke to him. Mexican troops involved in the Janos Massacre were stationed at the small town of Arizpe in Sonora, Mexico, and they met the Apache war party outside of town in the summer of 1859. Goyaałé led the 2-hour fight, and when it was finished, the Apaches were in command of the field. Impressed by Goyaałé's bravery, the Mexicans called him Geronimo. Some suggest that the name is a Mexican mispronunciation of Goyaałé. Others speculate that the troops that day might have named the Apache war leader for Saint Jerome, the fiery 4th-century saint depicted in Christian art as a lion. Indeed, Geronimo's ferocity in battle became so legendary that Americans would later shout his name as a battle cry. After the Apache victory at Arizpe, Geronimo led almost yearly raids against the Mexicans. Around 1851, Geronimo heard about some white men coming to measure the land to the south of his homeland. These men, led by John Russell Bartlett, were surveying the land to try to figure out a new boundary between Mexico and the United States. Accompanied by other warriors, Geronimo went to visit them. While not understanding each other's language and lacking an interpreter, the two groups still made a treaty with one another, promising to be brothers. After this group of surveyors left, the Apaches soon discovered miners combing the Indian hunting grounds for precious minerals. Apaches raided the miners' camps and stole their mules to show their anger over the invasion of Apache lands. Apaches thought gold was a symbol of the sun and sacred to their god, Usin, and they resented the miners coming to take it away. During the 1860s, whites advanced into the west and onto Apache land. Geronimo led many raids against white settlements and immigrant trains, terrorizing those who wished to settle in the region. United States soldiers were soon sent to protect the white settlers. To stop the fighting, United States officers invited the Apache leaders to hold a conference at Apache Pass in 1863. There, treacherous soldiers massacred many of the Apaches. Further trouble erupted, and the Apaches renounced their friendship with the white men, vowing never again to trust the United States troops. By 1871, Congress had passed a measure to fund the confinement of Apaches from Arizona and New Mexico to reservations. In 1872, President Ulysses S. Grant sent General Oliver O. Howard to Arizona to make peace with the Apaches. Geronimo claims to have traveled to Apache Pass to make a treaty with the general. In Geronimo's view, General Howard kept his word to the Apaches and treated them as if they were brothers. He claimed he could have lived in peace forever with them. If there is any pure honest white man in the United States Army, that man is General Howard, Geronimo recalled later, according to Geronimo, Apache freedom fighter. But peace did not last long. Even though Geronimo was ordered by military authorities to remain on the San Carlos Reservation, he managed to escape in 1875. For 2 years, Geronimo lived with a small band of followers, stealing Mexican cattle and horses and selling them in New Mexico. Meanwhile, the new Indian agent, a government official in charge of protecting Indians on a reservation and distributing government aid to them, John Clum, blamed every raid in the Southwest on the renegade Geronimo. Clum succeeded in capturing Geronimo in 1877 and kept him in prison for 4 months. A new Indian agent was appointed, and he freed Geronimo, who was now in his late 40s. Geronimo tried to live as a farmer on the reservation, but he and his people were not given enough rations. The Apache resolved to break out of the reservation again in 1881. Geronimo and a small band of followers left the reservation, raiding Mexico and the Southwest for food and supplies. While in the Sierra Madre mountain range, leading one of the bands on a Raiden Spree, Geronimo and his warriors were surrounded by United States General George H. Crook's troops and forced to surrender to government authorities in 1883. Geronimo was kept a prisoner under chains for 4 months and then transferred to San Carlos. He lived there peacefully until the summer of 1885, when a rumor surfaced that officers were planning to imprison Apache leaders. Fearing for their safety, the Indian leaders held a council meeting and decided that they would leave the reservation. Geronimo believed it would be better to die on the warpath than to be killed in prison. With 250 Apache followers, Geronimo and Woe led the Apaches through Apache Pass, where they met with soldiers in battle. Heading toward Old Mexico, they again encountered soldiers on the second day and fought well into the night. The soldiers were unaccustomed to fighting on the rough terrain, and the Apaches were well equipped with arms and supplies that they had accumulated while living on the reservation. After this battle, the Apaches were able to flee south to Casa Grande and camp in the Sierra de Sahuaripa mountains. Geronimo claimed that the Apaches roamed the area for 1 year and then returned to San Carlos, taking with them their cattle and horses. Upon their return to the reservation, General Crook ignored Geronimo's pleas and confiscated all the livestock that the Apaches had obtained rightfully from the Mexicans. Once again, the white men had cheated Geronimo. The Apaches had a powerful desire for alcohol, but a particularly difficult time handling it. For centuries, the Apaches drank twin, a fermented corn drink. Angie Debo notes in Geronimo, The Man, His Time, His Place, that although the drink had a relatively low alcoholic content, the Apaches were efficient drinkers. She adds that after a preliminary fast, they achieved a calculated debauch that threw the whole band into disorder. The resulting unruly behavior caused Indian agents to ban Tiswin from the reservation. Rules against drinking angered the Apache and influenced many to leave the reservation. Although Indians eventually returned to the reservations, alcohol continued to be a persistent problem for them. Some reservations continue to ban alcohol into the 21st century. Many scientific studies have pondered the problem of alcoholism among Native Americans. Peter Cooper Mancall explores the relationship between alcohol and Indians in Deadly Medicine, Indians and Alcohol in Early America. Alcohol abuse has killed and impoverished American Indians since the 17th century, when European settlers began trading rum for furs, writes Mancall. Indian deaths related to alcohol are 4 times higher than for the general population in the United States, according to Mancall. Upset with the decision, Geronimo undertook plans to travel to Fort Apache. Upon instructions from General Crook, officers and soldiers were told to arrest Geronimo and to kill him if he resisted. Informed of Crook's plans, Geronimo prepared to head south to Old Mexico with about 400 Apache. But while the Apache were camping in the mountains west of Casa Grande, they were surprised by government troops. Geronimo recounted that one boy was killed and nearly all of the women and children were captured. Geronimo and the others took refuge in the foothills of the Sierra Madres, but they were soon attacked again by a very large army of Mexican troops. Meanwhile, the United States Army also continued its efforts to rout the Indians. The Apache were weary from the fighting when Geronimo and his men decided to surrender to General Crook and a party of about 2,000 soldiers. But as the soldiers prepared to return the Indians to their reservation, Geronimo sensed treachery and escaped with 40 others back into the mountains of Mexico. As a result of Geronimo's escape, General Crook resigned and was replaced by General Nelson A. Miles. General Miles would pursue Geronimo like no other. Determined to capture and secure Geronimo under government control, General Miles ordered United States troops to trail the Apaches. Though they stayed ahead of the troops, the Apaches feared that if they returned to the reservation, they would be put in prison and killed, and if they stayed in Mexico, soldiers would continue to fight them. Hemmed in on all sides, Geronimo surrendered for the last time to General Miles in a canyon near Fronteras in Sonora, Mexico on September 4, 1886. Geronimo told Miles that, quote, "This is the 4th time I have surrendered." Miles replied, "I think it is the last," according to Miles' recollections. Geronimo did not know that this was the beginning of his life as a prisoner of war. Instead of being killed as he had feared, Geronimo became a prisoner of war. After his final surrender, Geronimo and his followers were shipped by train to San Antonio, Texas, where they were imprisoned. Shortly thereafter, Geronimo and his band were moved to Fort Pickens in Pensacola, Florida. The Florida climate was devastating to the Apache. Many died of tuberculosis and other diseases. Geronimo and other Apache leaders pleaded with the government to allow them to return to their homelands, but to no avail. Other tribes heard the Apaches' pleas. In 1894, the Kiowa and Comanches, both former Apache enemies, invited the Apache to live with them on their reservation near Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Geronimo spent the remainder of his life at Fort Sill growing watermelons. When the government agents let him leave the reservation, the once ferocious warrior supplemented his income by peddling his signature and coat buttons to curious onlookers at fairs and exhibitions like Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show in Buffalo, New York, Omaha, Nebraska, and St. Louis, Missouri. In February 1909, with a belly full of whiskey, Geronimo fell from his horse and spent the night sprawled in damp weeds. He contracted pneumonia and died a few days later on February 17, 1909. At the time of his death, Geronimo was still listed as a prisoner of war. Although Geronimo did not succeed in his attempts to return his people to their homelands, he had spent his life trying. Geronimo had fought against enormous odds to save his people, and he refused for 30 years to obey the commands of his white oppressors. During his numerous battles, Geronimo suffered 7 serious injuries, reinforcing his notion that no bullets could kill him. In 1913, Geronimo's people were permitted to return to Apacheria to live quietly with the Mescalero Indians in New Mexico. Goodbye, and rest in peace, the last Apache, Geronimo.